So I'm going to ask a few questions of our speakers, and they'll answer them in turn, and then we'll open it up to questions that you have, follow-up questions, and give them a chance to respond to each other a little bit. And I'm going to pass this down there, and you all just pass it around. And
just for you.
You can mute it for now so we can't hear you two whispering. I'm just teasing. We can't. Okay.
Sorry.
How do you turn it off?
Okay. So this is our Teaching Intersex panel. And my first question for the panelists, it's too big a question, so it's a little unfair, but could you define intersex, please? In the way you would when you have to do it in a nutshell, not in an hour, since many of us will be repeating your definitions of intersex and we won't have 5 hours to do so. So, yeah. If your quick explanation varies from context to context, give us the nutshell version for no more than 3 contexts.
Well, I was just talking earlier, I don't know if I was talking to Caitlin or someone else about when you meet someone new, relationship potential or just sex, you have to tell them you're intersex, and how do you do it without referring them to your website and having them read books and watch documentaries. And I used to do that. I used to say, hey, why don't you go see my website? But now I just tell them. I tell them that I was born intersex, and they go, oh, what is intersex? It means that I was born with a medical condition which causes me to be hermaphroditic, and where I identify as a woman, there's certain parts of me that are more masculine than others, and I'm also a Gemini, which means that I'm like double the fun.
That's tough to beat.
Yeah.
Well, I like to always describe it as an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different medical diagnoses, whatever the plural of that is. But that intersex people are folks whose bodies don't fit culturally defined norms for male and female, is usually how I would define it. And I usually try to make a distinction between sex and gender. So like people will ask me, you know, like I don't identify as female, I identify as intersex in terms of my sex, but then in terms of gender, I really identify as femme, but girl or woman works. So I always try to highlight the differences between those two.
The working definition I would offer would be the one I gave earlier, which is people born with sexual anatomies that society considers non-standard and has historically pathologized, but who, in the vast majority of cases, are just born with various, with very variant bodies. And in fact, bodies are much more diverse than I think people tend to think anyway. So that would be my definition.
Great. Thank you very much. The next question is, who needs to know about intersex? And I'll go ahead and give that to you with the next question, which is related. What do folks need to know about intersex? So who needs to know, and what do they need to know?
I think everybody needs to know. There's nobody who I think, you know, obviously, in terms of like the medical profession, talking to medical professionals and getting them to maybe change the way that they view intersex and the way that they approach intersex, there is some obvious, very urgent importance in that, because those are the folks who are actually doing these surgeries and causing the harm that we experience as intersex people. But I think the general public, everybody and anybody, not just academics, not just people in the medical profession, but everybody. That's part of why this has been, why the shame and secrecy has lasted for so long, is that Most people don't know about it, so you're very isolated, and you don't really feel like you can talk to everyday people about it. So it gives a lot of power because of that to medical professionals to really drive the conversation. So I think everybody and anybody. And how does that need to be done?
No, that's the next question. Uh-huh. That's the next question.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, next.
What was the question?
Who needs to know about intersex, and what do they need to know?
Well, you know, I was telling Caitlin earlier, I met someone, and it's hard for me, you know, I know I'm intersex. I mean, I've been intersex all my life. It's not something that happened yesterday like a mosquito bite. But it's always difficult to talk to on a personal level. And you would think that this is difficult for me, and it's not. But when you meet someone and you're romantically interested in them, and you have to tell them you're intersex, you know, it's hard because you're afraid of rejection. You know, so, but you have to do it. You can't. I don't want to be on the Jerry Springer show where I didn't tell someone and they're gonna take me on TV to out me or whatever. So I tell them, I bite the nail and I do it. Sometimes I do it really harshly, like, you know what, listen, you can deal with it, you know, or reject them before they reject me. Or sometimes I'm really soft about it, you know, and tears form in the corner of my eyes and crap like that. But I think everyone should know. Everyone in my life knows I'm intersex. If they can't deal with it, then they have no business in my life. You know, people in my job know. I was on Oprah and came out on Oprah, and people in my job was like, ooh, what's going on? I'm like, none of your business. Or I feel comfortable to tell people that aren't ignorant about it. So I think as an intersex activist, I have kind of like my job is to educate people, not just on college campuses, but in my everyday life. You know, I keep mentioning DePaul University. I was at DePaul University one time, and this person was making these ignorant comments about trans and intersex and passable, unpassable. And so I came out as intersex, and then it's an educational moment, you know, so a teaching moment. So sometimes I do it just for the effect of shutting people up, and sometimes I do it because it's really important to me. I'm very passionate about being me.
Same question?
Yeah. No, I have a special one for you.
I feel like y'all covered it so well. I mean, I totally agree. Everybody needs to know, and I approach this, you know, from the perspective of somebody who teaches undergraduate and graduate education, specifically women's gender and sexuality studies. This is leading into, I think, Angie's next question, but I want to advocate for moving beyond the additive model of teaching intersex and moving beyond what I call the exceptional model for teaching intersex. I can really only speak to teaching intersex in the context of WGSS, so please keep in mind that I'm limiting my remarks to that context. But the additive model is where, say, after doing the sex-gender distinction and maybe a little bit on the history of different sex-gender systems,
could you say quickly what the sex-gender distinction is? I think we've been talking about it a lot, and some people are like,
what Oakley
what are they
used,
talking
where
about?
Gender is understood as cultural and sex is understood as biological. And it was a distinction that was tremendously useful for both second wave and remains today, I think, if we're in the third wave, feminisms. So much mileage and political movement and intellectual energy has been mobilized out of this distinction. So I think the additive model is where instructors just put sort of one unit, and that unit will usually include a documentary and maybe Foster Sterling, or, you know, the 5 sexes, or you know, 1 or 2, and maybe sometimes I think people are moving more toward using personal narratives, and also I know I use a lot of websites, because I want students to learn about the history of activism, and especially the unique particularities of online activism and its connections to the world. The additive model has the problem of seeming to suggest, especially when used for teaching the social construction of gender and or sex, that it has the problem of seeming to suggest that non-intersex individuals' bodies are somehow less constructed, and that's deeply problematic. And then second, it positions people with intersex as if their lives and bodies are these exceptional teaching tools, which is just replicating the objectifying logic of the biomedical gaze. So it's really problematic too there. I think the essential thing to do when teaching intersex is to always connect it to related histories that aren't exactly equivalent, but that are related. So, for instance, you know, how is the history of intersex connected with the history of science and medicine around gender? It's a very fertile terrain. How is it connected with the field of women's health? How is it connected with the history of eugenics and sexology and nation and empire building projects? How is it connected to the complex circuits of transnational capitalism? These are essential questions to pose. So I want to advocate for integrating intersex actually throughout the WGSS curriculum so that it's not just an addendum or supplement to the standard WGSS emphasis on women or gender, but actually starts to reconfigure what those categories even mean and the very analytic frameworks and methodologies of inquiry of the field. But I sort of went into your next question. I'm really sorry.
No, you didn't. That was great. Excellent. Thank you. So my last question before we open things up is, can you go ahead and tell us, and I would love to hear you all engage with each other a little bit about these things. I've talked to each of you a little bit when I asked you for suggested readings. How do you convey these main points that you want to convey to people in the various contexts in which you teach intersex? So I mean, from sitting around the table talking with folks to, formally in the classroom, creating a syllabus for a semester-long class. So readings, films, stories, analogies, anecdotes, strategies, and other words. What are some of the strategies you use to get these points across? And then maybe what are some of the challenges of different ones? The point really here is there aren't simple right and wrong answers. This is a really complicated question. So go ahead and give as messy an answer as you like. We're not looking for the truth.
Well, I have my resource lists that I always give out when I do a talk on the back table. So that's kind of a cheat sheet of some of the resources that I recommend, both in terms of websites and organizations, as well as books and films. In terms of in the classroom, I always tell my personal story, and I do a more detailed version than the very, very brief one I did today because I wanted to talk about other stuff. So I think that's really important. And sometimes, when I first started doing intersex talks, it was really empowering to talk to people about it because I had been so ashamed that there was something really cathartic about saying in front of a group of people, this is who I am, this is how my body is, this is my experience, and I'm not ashamed. Sometimes that gets a little exhausting. It's deeply personal, and sometimes it's tiring, but I always tell my story because I think, again, it puts a human face to it. So easy, especially since intersex is so often in the classroom used to debunk biological determinism and all of that, that kind of removes it from the personal experience. So I use that as a tool to bring it back. So that's why I really suggest, if you're teaching, if at all possible, bring an intersex person to share their story. If that's not possible, find firsthand narratives. So again, you're kind of bringing it back to reality and to actual human experience. So that's one strategy I use. I also usually show a film. One in 2000 is a good one because it's short. So if you're going to a 50-minute long class, it's 20 minutes. So there's time to show it and also have conversation. The reason I do that is because there are many different experiences of intersex. Mine is my own. I have a diagnosis that most people who get my diagnosis don't get it until they are older. So most folks with my diagnosis get to have some say in what happens or doesn't happen to our bodies. And that's not the experience of many of the intersex folks that I know. So I like to offer multiple experiences. And I find, again, that really helpful to put a human face. Yeah, that's what I got right now.
And there's a couple of things in my life I'm really, really compassionate about. One is photography, one is intersex activism. And I found that a long time ago that in order for me to really open myself up and to allow people to get to know me and educate about intersex, I had to tell my life story. And I had to start from the beginning, you know, which is also includes the manipulation of a medical profession to psych me out to thinking that I was being hospitalized for my own good, you know, and convince me that it was, you know, for the greater good of all. You know, I also like to show videos. XXY is an hour and a half or 2 hour movie. It's really kind of long, but One in 2000 is a good brief documentary to show. There's also Is It a Boy or Is It a Girl, which is a little bit long, but it gets the point across. And it talks about the medical intervention, and it's actually narrated by a doctor, which is kind of interesting. But I think the best possible way to educate about intersex and for people to comprehend or to understand is to talk with compassion and to allow myself to be vulnerable and to talk about my history. This isn't easy. When we do this, you know, it may seem like, I mean, I use humor as well. I use humor to make me relax. So when I'm telling a joke, it's to help me to relax. You know, it's not so much as I'm trying to divert attention away from being intersex. You know, so I actually have a video of myself that I used to shoot all the time, and I perfected it. And I realized in the beginning of doing this that I wasn't being completely honest. It's like I was talking outside of myself. You know, I wasn't talking about me as if it was me. I was talking about me as if it was a patient or a subject or someone in the back of my rig. You know, I'm taken to the hospital. So I had to bring it back in and like I said, be patient-oriented instead of intersex-oriented. And so, yeah, it's deeper now for me, and it's more meaningful because I allow myself to open up and to, you know, wear my heart on my sleeve and to educate people. I think people learn better that way. And movies are great, documentaries are good, but when you talk from your own story, which is why it's important to have an intersex person at your intersex event, when they talk from their own story, you know, you feel their compassion and you feel their anger and you feel their hurt and disappointment, you know, and I think you identify with them, you know, even if you're not intersex, you can still identify with, you know, parts of their story. So, but I used to use PowerPoint, and like I said, that's what I was outside of myself. But yeah, I like being compassionate, and I like just opening up and getting people to know me, you know, not Linnell Stephanie Long, the fabulous woman, which I am, but Linnell Stephanie Long, you know, who's intersex and who has to deal with this every day on a daily basis in and out of relationships, you know, so on a job, so yeah.
I have a bunch of thoughts on this question. I think readings, strategies, challenges, I hope can have a bigger discussion with the whole group about this, because this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about.
And don't worry about editing yourself. David and I have been talking about this in the context of WGSS classes, and I think a lot of folks here are in women's studies, gender studies, and really interested in, you know, your specific thoughts on that context.
Okay.
So
Let me start with specifics and get that out of the way. So I think it is absolutely essential to move beyond the 5 sexes and even beyond the 5 sexes revisited, simply because to not do so shows that people are not keeping up with the scholarship, and that's shitty. Like, you know, I mean, it's assumed that, for instance, you know, in WGSS, it's assumed that I'm going to be up with the latest stuff even when it's not directly on my topic of inquiry, and I don't see why people don't always feel the same way about critical intersex studies. So that means the new work coming out by Ian Moreland, who I think is probably, in my view, in addition to being one of my heroes and role models, maybe the most important theorist writing about intersex today. Ian Moreland out of the UK is doing incredible work and is publishing like a madman. So check him out. He has a brilliant new piece in Signs, and he's in a book that Angie is in, Gender and the Politics of Science one. What's that called? I'm not trying to plug you here, but her essay is incredible too.
Thank you. I can't remember the name of the book. Laura, you taught it. What is it called?
The science of gender and the science of difference. Okay.
Okay, sorry, the title changed several
Gender and
times
the
through the
science of
publishing
difference.
process. I can't remember what it ended up being. That's embarrassing. Thank you.
Yes, and in addition to Moreland, Emily Grabham out of Australia, Jennifer Gurman out of Australia. There's amazing work coming out of Australia from the field of Australian feminist studies on intersex right now. So Jennifer Gurman is doing amazing work. Emily Grabham does killer work on intersex and citizenship. That is, I mean, I teach that in the same unit with Mary Wollstonecraft, Carol Pateman, and Neera Yuval Davis. And then I include this work on intersex and citizenship that's really pushing the boundaries and bringing together different fields, political science, women's studies, intersex studies. Likewise, in units on gender and the law, I include Noah Ben Asher's really important work on intersex and human rights, and I teach that alongside more familiar pieces by folks like Interpol Graywall or Human Rights Watch about Michaela Doras. Intersex material doesn't just have to fit into, you can see how passionate I'm getting about this, a unit on intersex. That's useful, but it relates to so many other things, and I hope those connections can become apparent in our discussion. For instance, I begin my intro to WGSS, Intro to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies course, by showing the film Sex Games. Don't worry, it's not some pornographic film. The title sounds like that. I always have to warn my students because they think we're going to be watching something obscene on the first day. Sex Games is about the history of sex testing in international Olympic sport. It's an older documentary now. It's put out by a British producer. I can't remember the name, but it's about the history of sex testing in international Olympic sport, and it introduces a number of highly relevant questions and themes for all my WGSS courses. How is gender connected with citizenship? How do bodies materialize in culture? How are they shaped by medical institutions and forms of power? How can they resist various forms of power or institutions? It's about the history of sex testing, but it usefully raises the question of why some bodies and not others are singled out as objects of inquiry for sex and gender trouble. So in that way, it highlights what in trans studies people are now calling cisgender privilege. And I know there are debates over whether or not that's the best term for what we're talking about here, and I don't want to go into those right now. We could later. But in any case, the privileges that people who are born and who identify as non-trans and non-intersex just get. And in the case of international Olympic sport, it's very clear that only certain bodies are targeted for these gender verification tests. They are always the bodies of people classified as women. That is to say, there's never been in history one example of a male athlete who's been singled out. Why is this? Why? Oh, interesting. Why is it that, I don't know, who's a really bad NBA player? Anybody?
Shaq.
No, Shaq was good. But, you know, I mean, it was never like some real bad player accused Shaquille O'Neal of having unfair masculine advantage. But Caster Semenya wins, or Maria Patino wins, or Santhi Soundaranjan wins, and suddenly the question is she a real woman? This is about the policing, not only of what counts as normative sex, but femaleness in patriarchal nation states and an international patriarchal system of sport that naturalizes athletic ability and prowess as inherently masculine. That's why these women consistently get targeted for these unfair verification tests, and men never do. What's amazing about this video is that it allows me to introduce concerns not only over like what is sex, what is gender, what role does science play in determining how people think about these issues, but also what role do nation states play, and also what role do various configurations of race and class play in shaping these discourses, as, for instance, Tavia Nyong'o and Pamela Scully have argued we can't really understand the Caster Semenya case, which Sex Games doesn't touch on, but I do teach this as well, without understanding the longer history of colonialism and empire, especially because what is going on, or what happened, and in some ways still is happening, in the case of the athlete, the middle distance runner Caster Semenya, is that her body as specifically a South African black woman was put on display, and that's related to a longer history of the objectification of black women. So it's not just gender and sex that are being policed, but race too, and we even heard from European athletes in the reporting about Semenya that people weren't just questioning her sex, but also her validity as a national subject and as a racial subject. So it wasn't just her sex that was being put into question. So in using this film, it's like the perfect opportunity not only to introduce questions that come from critical intersex studies, but questions of transnational women's gender and sexuality studies as well. So I find it really useful. But I didn't get to the challenges, but that's another thing maybe to talk about in a moment. But that's a useful tool to use.
I'd like to ask on behalf of myself and some of the nodding people in the audience that since you're not on Facebook, to share with us links to some of the resources that you find useful, that you please write them down on a napkin and send them to me in the mail so that I can transcribe them and put them online for you.
I don't want my name to appear on there, okay? I'll write a note.
I won't put your name on Facebook. I'll ask Caitlin to do it.
Okay, yeah, you got it. Challenges?
Okay.
Should we talk about that? Or should we open it up?
I think maybe we should open it up and see what, maybe hear some other people's challenges, or things you're curious about, sections where you might like to include something on intersex.
Can I do a shameless self-promotion real quick?
Do it.
I'm really interested in Caster Semenya, and I was bombarded with media requests when all of this was leaked to the media. And I wrote a piece that I'm really, really proud of with Moya Bailey and Mia Mingus, who are two incredible activists. Also, well, Mia's no longer in Atlanta, but we were all Atlantans. That's on my resource list. That is the three of us, one of us being disabled, two being women of color, and then myself being intersex, kind of responding to what was happening in the media around Caster Semenya, and I'm really proud, so I just want to promote that. So it's on the resource list. Now I'll shut up.
It's To Caster Semenya with Love. Is this the...
Yeah, it's called blog? To Caster Semenya with Love.
It's beautiful. You should read it. Okay. Sunny, could you? I suppose I could step down too, either for me to be here now. Just like being.
Is it working? Hi. So both Caitlin and Stephanie mentioned what? Linnell. I'm so sorry. I'm horrible with names. I'm like sorry.
Stephanie's another name, but go ahead.
So you both mentioned the importance of a personal narrative to the importance of teaching intersex. So how can we do that without tokenizing you?
I mean, I think, there are folks who do this and who, like Linnell and I, who this is what we do. We go around and do this type of work. So I think if you contacted anybody who does this type of work, they're going to be okay with that because that's what they do. But I think, for me, sometimes I do feel exhausted. I've had some experiences. For instance, someone who would say they were an ally of mine was invited to go to the UN in Geneva to talk about LGBTQI issues. And she literally called me at 5 in the morning, my time, from Geneva saying, I'm in this working group on LGBTQI, and we just realized we didn't have anything about intersex. So will you call me back and give me some data that we can put into the report? And that felt awful to me because I'm like, first of all, she woke me up at 5 in the morning. I didn't answer the phone. I get this message and I'm like, I did not call her back because it was like, wow. So it's like at the last moment, y'all realize that you didn't do your work and then you're going to call me and expect me to jump and respond. Like that felt really tokenizing. So I think there's a way to approach people. And also I struggled with this a lot. I do this stuff for free sometimes for my friends. But one thing that I've done to take care of myself was I started charging. And so, that to me is, and a friend of mine, Saha, was the one who really because I felt guilty. I felt guilty asking for money. And she was like, this is a strong comparison, but she used to work for Amnesty International, and they would bring torture survivors to tell their stories. And she's like, we realize the incredible emotional impact it has to share stories of trauma. So she's like, we pay those people really well, and you're sharing some of your very personal things, so you have a right to be compensated. So that, for me, when I started to feel burnt out, that was why I came back into the work. That was how I was able to do it. So I think paying people who do this work is really important, especially since unfortunately, the people who are typically making careers off of this aren't intersex people ourselves. So pay intersex people if you can.
Anybody else?
Hi. So I was just curious because I've heard you all sort of talk about teaching intersex in a college campus sort of context. Do you have any thoughts or ideas or experiences on teaching to younger crowds like elementary school, middle school, high school, that sort of thing?
Great question. Just a brief response, because it's something I haven't been able to spend as much time thinking about as I would like, but I'm a big advocate of doing so. But I know this is a very contentious subject. I came from a state, so I live in Nashville now, where our Tennessee Senate just attempted to pass, and thankfully failed, what they called the Don't Say Gay bill, which would have prevented at the high school level any teacher or counselor even using any of the words LGB or T or Q. And I don't know if they had the I. I doubt that the folks I'm thinking of here were including every letter they could think of. Their idea was just that the saying of words creates queer people, which is a remarkable misunderstanding of Judith Butler in a certain way, but I mean, anyway, there's a lot you could do there. But so it's a very contentious topic. I can imagine in Tennessee there would be great resistance to it, but I think it's really important, because otherwise what we're doing in high school and middle school biology especially is not just misteaching information, but in fact teaching incorrect information that we know now. Sex isn't determined by your chromosomes alone. It is a composite. This is very well established. And why there isn't an integration of feminist science studies material in high school classrooms, I think, is the same reason there is an integration of feminist material in most high schools. Though this is changing, especially at the private level. I have one student now at Vanderbilt who came to college from a high school that totally taught women's and gender studies and was already familiar, for instance, with intersex and these issues. So, but I think at the state-funded level, this would be an incredible challenge, though I'd love to hear, the other panelists' thoughts on ways we can do this, especially in conservative states, but not exclusively,
I was trying to think of the name of this book, but I can't think of it. I love you too, babe. There's a friend of mine, Twyla Brown. She wrote a book. It's kind of like for kids about intersex. And I was at a restaurant with one of my exes recently, and this waitress insisted on telling us about this book. I have two moms. Oh, you guys will love it. You're gay, aren't you? I'm like, whatever. But there are a couple of books out there, where you can explain it to kids that I'm not sure about taking it into a classroom, because then you have a bunch of moms and dads, come calling you and reporting you for whatever. But it is a touchy subject to talk about with kids, because I don't think they're mature enough to handle it, depending on the age group. My ex-girlfriend's daughter was 10 when I first met her, and she wasn't mature enough to handle it, because we talked about it, and she had really silly questions. But I think once you get into the teens area, like 13, they're able to understand it more and to comprehend it without, pointing fingers and saying, "Ooh, look at you," whatever. But Twyla Brown is her name, and it's a really good book I hear. And like I said, the one I have two moms touches on it as well, or two moms or two dads.
I haven't had many experiences with when I first started doing intersex activism, I was still considered a youth. I was like 18. So I did do some work. I actually, in Connecticut, I think it was in Hartford, I can't remember, it's such a blur, but I used to be on the board of an organization that doesn't really exist anymore, Bodies Like Ours, and they actually started a a youth initiative as a part of that. It didn't really take off. It's kind of weird, but I was one of the youth. And me and my partner at the time were sent to this conference, the Our True Colors conference, that was about queer youth. And we did 3 workshops. One was geared towards teachers. One was geared towards social workers and mental health professionals. And then the other was a caucus for queer youth and their partners. Me and my partner were the only ones that showed up. Actually, that's where I met AJ Clearway the first time was at that conference. But I would love to see intersex incorporated into all curriculum in school. I know for me, when I was diagnosed at, my mom's a feminist. I got a lot of information growing up. My mom went out and bought me like tampons and pads when I was like 10. I had this mom who was like very open with me and prepared me for puberty, in part because her mother didn't tell her about menstruation. So when she started bleeding, she thought she was dying. So she wanted to prevent that for me. So it was kind of stunning to find out that was never going to happen because I didn't know that was a possibility. So I think if changing curriculum so that intersex is a part of it in an age-appropriate way, I think that's where I would like to see us go. And I know that we're not there yet, and there would probably be a lot of resistance to that. But I know for me to have had this, been aware that there's more than just male and female, probably would have saved me some shame. So I'd like to see that change, but I know we have a ways to go.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a couple of ideas, and then I have a question. So I was thinking first about the tokenizing question, and as far as I understand it, I think that when tokenizing, it's just not making any real change, but just like selecting a person from a particular group to say we're cool or something like that, but not actually doing more than that. So I was thinking also a good way to avoid that in like curriculum is to introduce the material early in the semester and then like approach it as a lens that you can use like when looking at any other material. And you can also have more than one day on intersex. You could have like 3 or a whole unit
You're
on
radical.
it or something. And then with the kids' resources, there's a website that I have been to and I showed my class it, and I can't remember what it's called now, but I could send you the link or something. There's this interactive feature on the website, and it's a website for kids to teach them about their bodies and biology and medicine, more about just like their bodies. And so there's this interactive feature where you can see like the sexual differentiation process in utero and like how intersex conditions can develop, or how intersex bodies can develop. And it's interesting because you can like click on the thing and see how the bodies change. And then I have a question about law. So are any of you aware of any cases where people have brought their doctors, like have tried to sue their doctors, or have pursued any sort of persecution?
I think in the beginning we all wanted to sue our doctors. I think the whole intersex movement was like taking every doctor to court. But I think there's a statute of limitation on it. And not only that, when I was a kid, my mom signed a consent form. So I had to sue my mom first, then sue the doctor, and I wasn't going to do that. But I believe some people did, like newly people did, like an 18-year-old girl that they told she had a hemorrhoid, and she went in and they removed her gonads. I think she sued for them lying to her, and I think she won. But for the most part, the older generation, we lost out on that because we didn't take advantage of it within its limitation of time that we had.
And in addition to the statute of limitations issue, let's see how to begin this. In 1996, Congress passed a federal ban on what it called FGM, meaning female genital mutilation. Now, the ban was specifically designed to ban certain practices that emigrate, and there's a tradition of this, to the United States from largely African and some Middle Eastern regions. These are obviously highly contested practices, and we know this in WGSS, and there's a long history of debates and problematizations of neo-colonial perspectives on and attempts to eradicate FGM in both Africa and also in the places in the US where this is happening. So Congress got involved. They said, we're going to ban this, but the ban made an exception for medically necessary surgeries. And so with this ban in place, I'm writing about this currently, it makes it very difficult to sue physicians because physicians have the authority to determine what's medically necessary. And this is a tremendous gray area in the practice of medicine. And indeed, many physicians include purely aesthetic surgeries under the category of medically necessary. So in the United States, this presents a variety of challenges. There is an organization, Advocates for Informed Choice, headed by Ann Tamar Mattis, that is working on these issues and is providing a lot of resources to multiple communities who either identify with the term intersex or even to folks who identify as DSD. Her approach has been called by some of my colleagues controversial, but I think she's doing really interesting work at the very least and making resources available. She's working on legal strategy. Beyond the US, however, some things of note have happened. In Colombia in 1996, intersex surgery was banned across the board. 2 years, and I can tell you why if you're interested, 2 years later, that decision was revised. The Constitutional Court of Colombia had a case that looks a lot like what we now know as the John Joan or David Reamer case, basically. And a young man successfully sued his physician. This caused them to ban all surgeries. However, 2 years later, they revised their position with a new case and put in a stipulation that says no surgeries after age 6 without the child's consent. So they're still now performing in Colombia surgeries, and at rates that seem to look from, the data is very hard to gather here, but that seem to look a lot like the rates that still seem to be happening in the United States, which is, the figure is still about 5 surgeries are happening a day. And you know, obviously that data is very difficult to gather as well, especially because many hospitals don't even record it. Right. And you know, in 1 in 2000, when I think it's Cheryl Chase is telling this story of a physician, it still gets me every time, even when I think about it, where he was asked, how many intersex births do you have? And he says, oh, well, none, because we surgically normalize all of them. And they're not even keeping records about this, and how this one area of medicine, no, I shouldn't say it that way. There are many problematic areas of medicine, right? But how this one area has been allowed to be so sovereign unto itself and not face ethical criticism from the community. I mean, if it weren't for intersex activism, we still wouldn't even have these critiques. And it really strikes me that people put so much faith in medicine to determine not only medical decisions, but indeed legal and human rights decisions too. Sorry for going on about that, but this is an issue that I feel like needs more attention. The law should be a resource on intersex people's side, and instead it's worked against them in these cases. And that is a travesty, I feel like.
Yeah, I think there is, I mean, Advocates for Informed Choice, like David said, is really focused on the legal approach. And I haven't read this article yet, so I can't really tell you much about it. But when I was prepping for this talk, I was looking for resources just to see what other people were thinking about the disability and intersex connections. And I did find an article in a legal journal. Sunny, I can send this to you if you want, or anybody else, that is about, if you were to pursue litigation, would you go at it from a disability perspective or from a gender discrimination perspective? I haven't read it, so I don't know what what this person argues, but I know some people are talking about it and thinking about it. So,
I had a question. I know you guys had touched on it before about transgender with relationship to intersex, and rather than talk about the organizations like LGBT and how that's inclusive, I was wondering how you related to transgender people. I mean, either emotionally or politically, but just that I've noticed that in a lot of my classes, like my Intro to Gender Studies class, we just watched a film that had transsexuals and transgender people in the same film as intersex, and the film kind of talked about it as one clump.
What film was this?
It was called Middle Sexes.
Oh.
And it wasn't the best educational film. So I was just wanting to know more of your opinion about, you know, teaching about intersex and transgender and how the two relate to each other.
Great question.
You go first.
You know, in the beginning, when I was kicked out of the trans community, I was really like transphobic for a while, and this is me being honest. And I realized it wasn't every trans person's fault that, you know, I was kicked out. It was more because certain people felt insecure that, you know, I was prettier than them. I don't know why, but I just got kicked out, and I'm like, whatever. But it took me like 5-6 years to come to terms to accept that we're very close. I mean, whereas intersex is more about medical conditions, trans is maybe more about a mental state or wanting to change their medical condition. Somebody once said it, intersex is about stopping medical intervention and trans is about starting medical intervention or something like that. And I know a lot of trans people, and I know a lot of beautiful M to Fs, F to Ms, queer, bisexual, asexual people that if I sit back and deal with, if I was discriminated against them the way I was discriminated against, then it was just complete, it would just start the cycle all over again, you know, and then the next intersex person they met, they would hate or whatever, you know, but I think we're closer than we like to admit. You know, my medical intervention started when I was a kid. And I think if a lot of trans people thought about it, they would rather have the intervention when they were a kid as well. And they would rather, instead of going through puberty and high school, I mean, my high school years were horrible. I mean, I was raised as male, and I was forced to shower with guys with breasts, and it was like, what the hell is wrong with you? You know, so I think I can relate to trans people that way, you know, and especially males to females where they're trying to transition to something else. When I transitioned numerous times, oh my God, I transitioned from being my other name to Linnell, from being straight to gay, to being a dyke to being a leather dyke, you know, so it's like, it's constantly, for me, it's constantly evolving, but we have to remember that this world is too small to continue that vicious cycle of discriminating against each other. You know, when I say inclusivity with the LGBTI, I mean that. I don't mean LGBT. Don't forget, cross out the T's, go straight to the I. You know, because I don't know if Freela is still here, but as Freela was talking, there she is. As she was talking about earlier, we need that. You know, we need that kind of community where we can depend on each other and not feel alienated from each other or forced to feel alienated from each other. From, you know, even gay people that want to not accept trans people, but they accept intersex. You know, that's a big problem I had when I came out. They had no problem with me being intersex, but they would hate trans people. I didn't get it. I didn't get that at all. So I think me being on their side and doing activism, you know, for trans people really flipped their head because they didn't know what to say. And I did worry about them not accepting me in the lesbian community anymore, but my worrying about my trans sisters was more important than me being rejected by a bunch of old stereotypical trans-hating dykes. So, yeah.
For me, when I came out as intersex, trans folks were my biggest allies, and they were the folks who helped me think through the stuff that I was going on and who offered me an incredible amount of emotional support. So I feel very, you know, of course, there are individuals who I don't feel allegiances to as individuals, but as kind of the bigger community, I see the trans community as a natural ally to the intersex community. One of the things that sometimes is concerning to me that can be difficult is that because for those of us who are intersex, we do have relatively, I'm going to say, quote, easy access to surgical interventions, often without our consent, or in my case, even though I was older, nobody ever told me you don't have to do anything to change your body. It was more, you may not be ready now, but at some point you're going to have to, which is, really enraging to think that, I can't be a woman without a vagina. So anyway, I think, I have had some experiences that were troubling to me where folks have said, I'm jealous, I'm trans, and I wish I had an intersex diagnosis so I could get access to surgery. And I think that's kind of, I think anybody should have access if they want to transition in whatever way they choose, they should have access to that. And we shouldn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to prove that we should have access to whatever decisions we want to make about our bodies. But I think, thinking about the building, relationships between intersex and trans communities is to kind of think about that kind of stuff. Like, it isn't exactly been a privilege that I have access to vaginoplasty if I want to have it. So I think that is something to think about. And yeah, I think I was talking about this earlier. Seth, who was my partner when I came out as intersex, after we broke up, he had top surgery, and he actually lives in Richmond, Virginia, and so he went to Johns Hopkins for top surgery. And when I first started doing these workshops, I was so scared he would do the workshops with me. He read every book that existed at the time. He really educated himself and really supported me, which I am to this day extremely grateful for. But he said, it was kind of hard for me to go to Johns Hopkins and to realize that the legacy of, the surgery that I'm consenting and choosing to have has been on the backs of intersex folks, and kind of just being honest and exploring the complications of that. But yeah, I definitely see trans folks as big allies.
So you've given us a lot to think about, and I'm thinking of the Intro to Women, Gender, Sexuality course, right? We have 14 weeks in which to cover a very big field. And I was hoping you would have some advice to how you would enter into these questions of sex, gender, sexuality. Would you teach it as a block? Would you teach it in the beginning, middle, end? Would you teach it right through? How would you enter into these questions? And how would you progress in documenting this very rich history, how troubled all these categories are, all the experience, the histories of these. So how would you approach it?
Well, I tell you, a friend of mine is a professor at DePaul University, and she would teach women's studies, and she would teach the whole history of feminism, blah, blah, blah. And then she came to this one part of intersex. She would invite me there, talk to her class, and then she would keep going. And I always wish that there were a semester in intersex. There's so much more. And if you study intersex in that semester, you have to study trans. Because transgender warriors, were there before intersex. Intersex people are always there, but trans people were on the front lines fighting, at Stonewall. So if you're going to talk about intersex, you have to talk about trans people. And I think in educating people about trans and intersex, you're able to get more acceptance to people, because they think that intersex is great because we look like women or men, whereas trans people sometimes have problems passing. But I think if you see the similarity between trans and intersex, they have more acceptance maybe for trans people, and not just sympathy for us or empathy for us. You know what I mean? Did I answer your question?
Do you want to? I know you're in the classroom.
Yeah, I'm arguing for full integration throughout, but I know that can't always be done. So there are ways the additive model can still be used without reproducing tokenism, I think, and while still raising these critical questions about what constitutes sex here. How is gender being regulated? What role is heteronormativity playing in the process? And I think all three of us touched on this today. And the history of the medicalization of people with intersex, heterosexuality was used as a gauge of successful treatment, which is so deeply problematic, right? So there's ways to make these connections, even if you're going to continue with the additive model. And I understand some folks, won't be able to shift. On the other hand, I think there could be real advantages to bringing materials on issues related to intersex and the history of medicine and science into places where you don't expect to find them, because then students can start creating these unlikely connections and seeing both the connections between the different means various societies use to regulate sex and gender, but also the differences too. The connections and the differences are what's important for me in teaching and attempting to teach both a transnational and intersectional approach to women's and gender and sexuality studies. So the question is sort of that I'm constantly finding myself returning to in each unit. It's how are folks that fall in different areas of the categories of gender, race, class, sexuality, nation, age, ability, how are they being treated by these different discourses? What systems of privilege are operative here, or what forms of normalization are operative here? And trying to encourage students to begin learning to formulate analyses of these different processes, which are related but aren't the same and aren't reducible to just one common denominator. But I think focusing on connections and differences is really, really useful.
I had another thought about the trans question, and I wanted to give a shout out to Julia Serrano and her book Whipping Girl. If folks haven't read it, that was a really helpful book for me too, in terms of thinking of my experience of gender and how that relates to sexism and transphobia. So that's a book that I want to give a shout out for as well. And I want to say too, I think I don't like when intersex and trans are conflated, because I think that's hurtful to both intersex and trans folks and takes away from the unique experiences. So I think it's important to draw those parallels and make those connections, but not do it at the expense of the differences. So, sorry. Random.
If anybody wants to share strategies you've used that you've found successful, I think, would you all be open to hearing about? I would love to hear. That would be useful, especially. Or particular challenges you've faced in the classroom that you'd like to think about, that would be really good fodder as well.
I had a question going back to the discussion around strategies and allyship and inclusivity in organizations, and also the question that was asked earlier about introducing this concept in like a younger curriculum. I worked in a community-based organization with youth ages 12 to 21, and we get a lot of trans youth that come into our organization, particularly because they feel alienated by their GSAs, and we've had a lot of really interesting conversations. Our group belongs to a larger sort of statewide network, and we connect and help support GSAs within the system, but in terms of our relationship with the Department of Public Health, we have a very interesting relationship in the sense that we can oftentimes do a little bit more in terms of edgy activities around safer sex and sort of non-heteronormative models of education around safer sex and things like that. But we haven't had any youth that are coming to us that identify as intersex. And from some of the personal narratives and the themes that have been shared today, you've all have said, people will come up to you after these talks. A lot of the context in which that has happened, it sounds like it's in post-secondary education, institutions, and also, when you were older, it sounds like a lot of the medical intervention that's happening is happening at a very young age, obviously without consent, and then it's like you flash forward 15 years later, or you're in college. And so I was curious if you had any advice or suggestions or strategies around maybe how to reach out to those, to youth that are in that in-between stage so that you can have that intervention or have that connection and that support at a maybe earlier age.
I would suggest, maybe doing something on intersex specifically in your organization to kind of raise the topic. One thing in addition to the shame and secrecy that people experience which keep them from speaking out is that historically intersex folks were lied to. So there are folks out there who had surgery, had some kind of intervention as a child who don't know, who were told, you had a hernia, we had to do surgery, that's why you have that scar, when really they were removing gonadal tissue. So that's another piece of it, is that people may not actually know the full truth of their own medical histories. I actually recently, I have a friend in Atlanta who helped found the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition, and I just got kind of tricked into becoming an advisory member for the organization. But one of the things, him and I sat down to kind of talk about it, and he was saying, you know, we're having this conversation about whether to add the I, and there's a lot of debate around it. And we ended up, over the course of dinner, he had me over for dinner and we kind of talked through it. He came to me and was like, I want to add the I. And the reason is because I know that there are youth who are struggling with this and don't know that there are spaces where they can have those conversations and resources that exist. So he asked myself and Danny Lee Harris, who is another out intersex activist who's Atlanta-based, if we would become advisory members of this organization so that we're available as a resource to intersex youth who may somehow come in. And they're a coalition of a lot of gay straight alliances and organizations that focus on high school age queer youth. So I think, you know, kind of creating the space for that is a good first step. So that folks know that there are people who are somewhat knowledgeable about the issues.
No, I go to the AIS conference every year, and they're teaching kids not to come out as intersex or with DHD. They're teaching them, when you go to the college campus, to just go there and do your schooling and then move on to society. But I think there are people that want to come out and they're looking for some type of support. A movie night is a really good idea. And there's a lot of good intersex documentaries. I mean, the intersection documentary is phenomenal. You know, so I think maybe if you have a movie night or something that would not force them to come out, but you can still be at your center. I think it would help a lot of people that are afraid that the moms or dad will stop their funding and think about it as intersex. And it's sad because I actually witnessed this at this AIS conference. You know, these 14, 15-year-old girls, you know, they had the vaginoplasty, they had the gonads removed, and now they just want to get married and be normal little girls, which is great. I'm not hating on that or anything, but I also think that those that don't want to blend into society need the space as well, but they just maybe not know how to come to your center without being tokenized or something.
Just one brief thing to add. In the classroom, I've been teaching intersex issues for a while now, and in the last 7, 8 years, I am seeing changes. Like, the students I was teaching 7 years ago, most would come to the classroom not knowing about the word intersex or any of its history, and that is not the case anymore by any means. And not only do I have more intersex identified students than ever before, feeling like they can come out either with me in person or sometimes even in class, not only that, but it's now very clear that in WGSS, we can't teach intersex and assume that the majority of our audience is non-intersex. That's offensive to do that, and for a variety of reasons. Because once again, it's recentering the hegemonic invisible center and the norm, right? So, the intersex movement, you know, what was started back in the early 1990s in San Francisco and spread around the globe, literally around the globe, not evenly everywhere, but around the globe, is changing things, and I'm already seeing those changes in what is, you know, thus far a relatively short teaching career. And there's still a long way to go, undoubtedly, and obviously the high school and the levels you're talking about and are so important. But I think we should see that as a positive sign, that these changes are possible. In general awareness of these issues, in an opening up of new possibilities of identity in the culture, people feeling they don't have to, people reckoning with the legacies of trauma, silence, secrecy, and shame, and overcoming them, speaking out against them, and creating new possibilities for young folks.
And you had a question?
Mine's kind of off topic if you want to continue on this.
Hi, I have a question. It's a little bit off topic, but it's something I'm kind of curious about. Is what are your opinions on studies on intersex, especially in particular studies with women with CAH, in regards to gender differences and things like mathematical ability and spatial reasoning and things like that?
A controversial area of research, yeah. I mean, and this is related to what Caitlin was talking about earlier with the drug that I can't pronounce as well.
I think it's dexamethasone.
Dexamethasone.
Or dex,
yeah,
for short.
Prenatal dex, I think, really raises serious ethical issues that anybody interested in debates over reproductive technologies, and especially this very thorny issue of designer babies, which everybody says they don't want, but then everybody wants. We all want the most perfect baby. Sorry, I don't mean to make fun of that. I understand. I don't have babies, but I have a cat, and I want him to be the most perfect little cat ever. No, it's not the same. Sorry, bad analogy. These are very contested issues. But if you go, for instance, to Fausto Sterling's brand new book, which I really like, but also maybe have some problems with, Sex/Gender Biology in a Social World, she does seem to be relying on the harder social scientific research that is demonstrating the kinds of findings you're pointing toward. I don't want to say those findings should be accepted right away, or that they should be automatically thrown out and questioned. I really don't know. And how we measure things, like back to the hardwiring paradigm of male and female brains, how we measure something like the effects of prenatal hormones on who a person could be is such a complicated question. And as somebody who does science studies from a critical perspective and more of a humanistic approach to science studies, I can't get enough inside the science, I feel like, to really fully buy in, but I could be wrong. So I'm really unsettled, as you can tell from my answer to you. I don't know what to do with that sort of material. And I think it's interesting, but I also always want to ask, but why is this research being done? You know, it's the same question I ask when I teach the history of craniometry. Why did physicians care about measuring skulls? Because they were trying to prove that white, wealthy men were smarter than everybody else, right? So it's not uninfluenced by biased ideologies. That would be my worry, at least. But I'm curious if y'all have other perspectives.
I actually had never heard of the Dex drug. I've read about the whole article about the CAH, but in preparing for today, I didn't read enough about it to comment on it. So,
with the whole Dex controversy, Alice Dreger, who I have some issues with. However, she, on Psychology Today, has done a multi-part series on, and I think she published an article with somebody else kind of exposing this, because the FDA hasn't actually approved this drug for what it's being used for. So there's a lot of ethical concerns around that. But this series, with my whole caveat, I think is a pretty good and very accessibly written, not academically written kind of series, kind of following how they found out about this and what they have done to try to bring attention to it. So Psychology Today's website has that.
Oh, sorry. Am I allowed to say something?
No.
I wanted to push all three of you a little bit. I feel like I've learned a lot from all three of you, and then I was really disappointed in your responses about teaching kids. Come on. Well, I mean, I'm going to push you on this. We teach kids about anatomy. We teach kids about things that are going to change in their bodies. I feel like outside the context of sort of public school curriculum, when we're talking to kids about these things that we talk to them about, we don't say things like, women have vaginas, or the people who have babies are mothers. Do you know what I mean? Like, there are ways that we disrupt these things in all the different ways that we teach kids about sex, gender, and sexuality, about anatomy, and about families, and be more optimistic.
Let me start by saying my ex-girlfriend's daughter, Tali, is the most inquisitive little girl I've ever met in my life. And when she started asking me about intersex and what is intersex and all the conditions of intersex, you know, it's kind of like, you know, what is this? What is that? And it goes on and on and on and on. And at first, like I said, her question was really silly, but now when she asks questions, like I said, I think she's mature enough to hear the truth. I have tons of documentaries at home that we watch. You know, I have lots of books I refer her to. You know, but the best thing I tell her, you know, she asked me, she once told me, once asked me what is intersex, and I told her, and then she said, well, are you intersex? I'm like, yeah. And I said, how are you intersex? So I told her my story, and she said, oh, I love you, you know, so it's like, yeah. So it's some people are ready to hear it. I don't think some people are. You don't want to force it on them either. You don't want to go down there and say, this is an intersex condition and my story, and it can be kind of brutal or, you know, traumatic for some kids. So I think it's a really sketchy subject.
I guess part of what I wanted to say is I feel like there are these ways in which we can make it a lot easier for them to hear it later on, so that when they hear the word and they hear about these, you know, medical models, they seem less intuitive. It seems less of a big step to think of the world differently. Do you know? I don't know.
I agree, but what we're up against, it's important to measure and really effectively analyze what we're up against, I would say. For instance, everybody remember, or if you don't, you should write it down and go read it, Emily Martin's famous The Egg and the Sperm from, what is that, 88? Yeah? Or 90 maybe? That's still being taught in intro biology and human sexuality, excuse me, not that article. The textbooks she critiques in that article are still being taught in intro to biology and human sexuality courses at universities around the globe. Even with like the blatant falsities she revealed. The egg is not purely passive, for instance. The sperm aren't strong little he-men with the voice of Bruce Willis, like in Look Who's Talking. And that's anthropomorphism. Like, there's a much more complicated story to be told here, but they're still teaching that even. So even on college campuses, the politics of knowledge are a struggle, right? And that was the only reason. I didn't mean to like use the Tennessee don't say gay example to like try to escape your question, but we're up against a lot. And I think especially from parents who are highly invested in gender binarism and sexual dimorphism, it's not that we couldn't teach kids who come from those families about that bodies are more various and diverse, and that maybe they're a little more complex than most people think, but that we would receive tremendous ideological opposition from parents. The question my students always ask is, well, what, should there be no gender? They jump to this, and this is one of the challenges of teaching intersex. I don't know why they jump to this. Nobody I teach, no article says, get rid of gender. And very few intersex people embrace that argument, actually, at least the theorists and activists who I'm teaching. But for some reason, students think that like if there's something bad about gender, then get rid of it, which is this fascinating move. And there are many other options. You're absolutely right. We can complexify it. We can change up how we think about pronouns. We can even talk about language with kids critically, right? Like, and they're into it, usually. So I'm glad you bring up this point.
I don't spend a lot of time with kids. I'm not a big fan of kids, to be honest.
I didn't want to
and
say
Angie,
that.
I think Angie, I think you actually might have an answer to this question because you have thought about this with kids. So I think you have some expertise that you could share to throw it back on you. But I will say, like, for me, I have a brother who's 5 years younger than me, and when I came out as queer, I was 15, so he was like 10. And it always pissed me off that people have to come out as queer, that you're like assumed heterosexual until you make some big announcement otherwise. So I decided not to come out. And I just talked about girls, and I had girlfriends, and you know, like it was just kind of, it was never a thing. It was just always the way it was. So my brother, probably a year or so after that, he had a pack of pens. He had got different colored pens, and there was a purple pen. And so, being the silly femme that I am, I was like, "Ooh, can I have the purple pen?" And he was like, "Yeah, kids at school say that purple is the gay color." And I said, well, there's not really a gay color, but so what? Who cares? If you like purple, go for purple. And he said, oh, no, I defend you. And that was the first time I realized that he had kind of figured this out. And so I think, you know, how interacting with a kid could I kind of talk to them about, you know, the kind of spectrum of gender and sex and sexuality in a way that's just kind of, it's not some big announcement. It's not some big, like, we have to have a serious conversation. It's just kind of the way that they always hear about that stuff. It is one of my pet peeves when I always go crazy when, like, I had a coworker who was pregnant. She came in and announced to us that she was having a boy. That bothered me on multiple levels. I think we should, I like gender, but I don't like telling people what their genders are. I would love to live in a world where we don't gender people and we let people decide for themselves what their genders are. I always say when I get the question about, okay, well, what do we do if there's an intersex baby? If you think surgery is bad, then what should we do? And the question that I answer that by saying, because people are like, should there be like, M, F, and I, or, everyone gets labeled a gender except intersex people. And, my answer to that is that intersex folks are already facing a lot of stigma. If we're gendering everyone except intersex children, what will that cause for them emotionally? But really, my goal is to see us stop gendering people and let folks decide for themselves what their genders are.
I have a friend this is anecdotal. I have a friend who has a baby and uses the pronoun they for the baby and is raising the baby that way. And it's going to wait till the baby tells her their gender identity. But what I was going to say before that is that in my experience, actually, it's much easier for kids to understand my transness than adults. And also, like, friends of mine and people I've interviewed for my research, like, a lot of people say that the kids really understand it really easily. And I remember one time I was working with a 4-year-old, and he was like, "Are you a girl or a boy?" And I was like, "Some people think I'm a girl and some people think I'm a boy." And I just left it at that, and he was like, "Oh, you're mixed." And I was like, "That's right, actually." Like, he totally got it. He got it, and then he just like continued coloring or whatever. So I think that it's less of an issue for teaching kids about it. And like you were saying, it's more like adults that have a problem. But usually when I am explaining intersex in classes, I'll just talk about how bodies have biological variation, and we decide which bodies count as intersex, and we create this word for it, and that's what it is. And it's just like, actually arbitrary, like what we decide counts as intersex.
Totally.
I don't know.
It's you.
So I was going to go back to the classroom issue, but it follows on from what Sunny just said about this random decision about which bodies are anything classified.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's better. Okay, so I was just thinking about classrooms and thinking about how to talk about intersex in classrooms. And one of the things I've been thinking about all throughout the day, and everything you've said has been really helpful, has been about the course that I'm teaching at the moment, which is about the body and empire. And we start in kind of roughly 1760 with Captain Cook and gender confusion over his encounters with in the Pacific, and we go on to Hercules Barban, and we look at Sarah Bartman, and we look at Hijraz, and we look at all sorts of things, all of which could actually be called intersex, except that intersex is such an incredibly Western definition. So on the one hand, I'm faced with the idea that actually most of my course could collapse into being called a course about intersex. And on the other hand, not wanting to make that collapse. So I'm kind of thinking it through. And I wondered if you had any comments about it.
I think that's a really interesting way of mapping a certain kind of quandary. Why I would be hesitant to put your whole course under the label intersex. Huh? Okay, yeah, I mean, the reason why yes, I see what you're saying. It does seem important to me to distinguish not only between the meanings certain words get in a culture or different cultures, but also the function of the terms and the specific histories they come from. For instance, I think it's very useful, like you're doing, indeed it sounds like we have very similar approaches, to do a cross-cultural comparative and transnational approach to sexual and gender diversity, yeah? Or to just anatomical diversity in culture, and how different cultures understand it, the conflicts that emerge, say, when the first colonizers came to the Americas and misrecognized Native American Indian gender diversity, labeling gender variant men, for instance, beardash, right, which was a term that came from Arabic, and there was all kinds of homophobia in that labeling, but they were also misrecognizing this. So their Eurocentrism was preventing them from adequately even encountering other forms of being in the world, right? Other forms of understanding oneself. And I think the danger is, and it's a danger that applies to the category of transgender too. I mean, some would say, well, let's include all gender diversity under, and some do. I mean, trans is an umbrella term too, and you could teach your course as sort of trans-gender might be a cool name for it, right? But also there could be problems there because of Western centrism and this just imposing that label, say intersex or transgender, on all the different phenomena you're talking about runs the risk of erasing those variations, right? I don't know what the right name is, but I think the model you're using is absolutely, sounds fascinating and really productive, and I'd love to talk with you more about it.
I think, yeah, I've thought some about the like umbrella terminology, and with like I've had people ask me about polycystic ovarian syndrome, and you know, a lot of people are diagnosed with. I mean, I know so many people who've been diagnosed with PCOS, and is PCOS an intersex condition or not? And what I think is still, like, to me, I'm more interested in kind of the medical, you know, a lot of folks that I know with PCOS are women and they have a lot of hair on their bodies. And so, you know, that is a concern of the medical, it may not be the same as having, you know, surgery pushed or actually done on you, but it's coming from that same place of, you know, this is how men are, this is how women are, there's nothing else except these two, and we have to make sure that people stay in these boxes because otherwise, you know, the world is going to be chaos, apparently. So I think, you know, it is useful to kind of think about, again, like that's why I get really like nerded out over, you know, the intersections and kind of the similarities that different groups experience, because I think, you know, a lot of the stuff is coming from the same places. So it's helpful to kind of deconstruct that. But also I think it helps us, you know, better understand and relate to one another, because we have experienced overlapping things. They may not be identical, but that creates that kind of like that space for people to become allies, because often you have to kind of connect with someone's personal experience to get them to relate to you and your experience. So yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to think about that without, in the process, erasing the differences that people experience. I don't know if that at all answers the question.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much.